Maybe you and I need to have a real conversation about knowing your place in a town that doesn't know you." The barrel of a police revolver pressed against her temple. 11 people watched from their booths. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Officer Grant Dolan waited for the begging, the crying, the apology he'd earned from every person in Millhaven who ever crossed him. It never came. The woman didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her hands, still holding 2 breakfast plates, stayed perfectly, impossibly still. "You've got a decision to make, officer," she said quietly. "Put that weapon away, and we both go back to our day. Or you keep pointing it at an unarmed woman in front of 11 witnesses and see how that follows you for the rest of your life." What Grant Dolan didn't know was that the waitress he'd just threatened had spent 15 years doing things this town could never imagine. And she remembered every face in that room.
There is a moment right before a gun goes off in your life. You do not hear it coming. You just feel the air change. That is what happened to Wren Calloway on a Tuesday afternoon in Millhaven, in a diner that smelled like coffee and bacon grease, in front of 11 strangers who would remember that moment for the rest of their lives. A police officer pressed the barrel of his service weapon against her temple. He wanted her to beg. She did not. To understand why, you have to go back 1 week, back to the morning she walked into town with 1 duffel bag and a stranger's face. Millhaven sits where the cornfields end and the old highway begins. It is the kind of town most drivers pass through without noticing. A grain silo, a water tower painted with a faded school mascot, a single stoplight that blinks yellow after 9 at night. You could miss it in a sneeze. But the people who live there do not want you to miss it. They want you to slow down, roll your window down, say good morning to a stranger and mean it. That is the town Wren Calloway walked into on a Sunday morning in late September. She came off the bus with 1 duffel bag over her shoulder, no suitcase, no phone pressed to her ear, just a woman in her late 20s, dressed plain, walking with a posture that made people glance twice without quite knowing why. Her back was straight. Her steps were even. She did not look lost, even though nobody in Millhaven had ever laid eyes on her before. She walked past the hardware store, past the barber shop, its striped poles still unmoving for years. She stopped in front of a diner with a faded sign that read "The Anchor." Inside, an old bell rang over the door. A woman behind the counter looked up, late 50s, apron dusted with flour, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. This was Peggy Sullivan. She had run that diner for 22 years, ever since her husband passed. "Morning," Peggy said. "Sit anywhere you like." Wren did not sit right away. "I saw the sign in your window," she said. Her voice was even, unhurried. "You're hiring." Peggy looked her over, not unkindly, just carefully, the way a person checks a used car before handing over money for it. "You ever waited tables before?" "No, ma'am." "You ever worked a job where people yell at you for things that aren't your fault?" Wren almost smiled. Almost. Something like that. There was a pause, a long one. Peggy had learned over 22 years to trust her gut about people, and her gut told her something about this young woman did not add up. Not in a bad way, in a way that made her curious instead of careful. "Rent's due Friday for most folks in this town," Peggy said. "You got somewhere to stay?" "Not yet. There's a room above the hardware store. Old man Whitaker rents it cheap if you don't mind creaky floors." "I don't mind much of anything," Wren said. "Creaky floors included." Peggy wiped her hands on her apron and stuck one out. "Start tomorrow, 6 a.m. Don't be late, and don't ask me twice about the coffee machine." "It's older than my daughter would have been." Wren shook her hand. Her grip was firm, controlled. The handshake of someone who had been trained somewhere, sometime to hold steady under pressure, though Peggy could not have said how she knew that. She just knew it. She just did not know yet what it meant. By 6:15 the next morning, Wren was already refilling ketchup bottles before her shift officially started. Peggy watched her from the kitchen window and said nothing. She liked people who showed up early. It usually told you something about how they were raised or what they had learned the hard way. The regulars started rolling in around 7. There was Harold and Dot Pemberton, married 51 years, who split one plate of eggs every morning because Dot said the portions had gotten too big for two people who used to farm 60 acres by hand. There was Ruth Alvarez, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down and always ordered black coffee, no cream, because she said cream made her slow, and slow was a luxury she could not afford before 8 a.m. And there was Earl Matson. Earl came in every single day at 7:15. He sat in the same booth by the window, the one with a slight wobble that nobody had ever fixed because Earl said he liked knowing which chair was his. He was 78 years old, a widower, a man who had spent 30 years driving grain trucks across 3 counties before his knees gave out. He always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, no sugar. Wren brought his plate over that first morning and set it down gently. 2 eggs, wheat toast, she said. Coffee's fresh, I promise. Made it myself 20 minutes ago. Earl looked up at her over his glasses. New girl, he said. It was not a question. Wren. Earl. He nodded once like that settled something important. You from around here? No. Didn't think so. You walk like someone who's been somewhere. Wren paused for just a second, just long enough for Peggy, watching from the counter, to notice. Everyone's been somewhere, Earl, Wren said and moved on to the next table. Earl watched her go. Something crossed his face that Peggy recognized, a man doing quiet arithmetic in his head. Old math from a long way back. He said nothing else that morning, but he kept watching. The diner had a rhythm to it. Most small-town diners do if you pay attention. Breakfast rush from 6 to 9, a lull until lunch, then the after-school crowd that never came anymore since the high school had closed and merged with the county district 2 towns over. Wren picked up the rhythm fast. She learned which regulars wanted their coffee topped off without asking and which ones wanted to be left alone with their newspaper. She learned that Peggy hummed old country songs under her breath when things were good, and went silent when something was bothering her. 3 days after Wren arrived on a slow Wednesday, just before noon, Peggy went silent the moment the bell over the door rang. Wren looked up from the table she was wiping down. A man walked in wearing a Millhaven police uniform, mid-30s, built like someone who spent more time at the gym than on patrol, sunglasses pushed up on his head despite the overcast sky outside. This was Officer Grant Dolan. He did not sit at a table. He walked straight to the counter and leaned on it like he owned the place. Peg, he said, coffee, and bag me a couple donuts. Peggy did not look at him. That's $12.50, Grant. Come on, Peg, you know how this works. I know how it's worked for 3 years, Peggy said, her voice tight. Doesn't mean I like it. Dolan smirked and turned, scanning the room like he was hunting for an audience. His eyes landed on Wren. Who's this? New girl, Peggy said too quickly. Started Monday. Dolan walked over to where Wren stood, rag still in hand. You got a name, new girl? Wren, he said it slow, tasting the word, deciding he did not care for the flavor. Where you from, Wren? Around. Around's not a place. It's the only one I've got right now. A few of the regulars had gone quiet. Harold and Dot traded a glance. Ruth's hand tightened around her coffee cup. Earl, in his booth by the window, set down his fork. Dolan leaned in closer. We don't usually get strangers wandering into town and picking up work, not without somebody vouching for them. I'm not a stranger to myself, Wren said. That's usually enough to get through the day. Harold let out a short laugh, quickly swallowed once Dolan shot him a look. Dolan turned back to Wren, his jaw tightened. Cute, he said. We'll see how cute you are once I run your plates. I don't have a car. Then I'll run you. He said it like a threat because it was one. In Millhaven, everyone understood exactly what it meant when Grant Dolan decided to run your name. It meant digging through databases he had no legal reason to search. It meant using the badge like a crowbar instead of a shield. Wren did not flinch. You do what you need to do, officer, she said. I've got tables to clear." She turned and walked off. Dolan watched her go, somewhere between annoyed and intrigued. Most people pushed like that either apologized or shrank down small. She had done neither. He grabbed his coffee and his bag of donuts and left without paying the $12.50. Peggy exhaled once the door swung shut behind him. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Push back. Grant doesn't forget things like that." Wren kept wiping the counter, slow and even. "Neither do I," she said. Here is something worth understanding about small towns like Millhaven. Power does not always wear a badge or hold a title or carry a gun. Sometimes it wears silence instead. An entire community agreeing without ever once saying it out loud not to make waves. Grant Dolan had learned that trick early. His father, Walter Dolan, spent 16 years on the town council before stepping down 2 years back. People still called him councilman out of habit, maybe out of something closer to fear. Together, father and son had built something rotten underneath the town's friendly surface. Nobody spoke of it directly, but everybody knew the rules. You did not question a traffic stop. You did not report a missed inspection. And if the Dolans asked you to sign something, you signed it, smiled, and thanked them for stopping by. Earl Matson had lived under those rules for 2 years, ever since his wife passed, and the medical bills started climbing faster than his pension could keep up with. 3 days after Wren started at the diner on a bright Thursday morning, Grant Dolan walked into the Anchor again. This time he was not after free coffee. He walked straight to Earl's booth and sat down across from him, uninvited. "Earl," he said, "we need to talk about the property." Earl's shoulders went stiff. "I told you already, Grant. I'm not signing." "It's a good offer. Fair market value plus a little extra for the trouble. It's my land. My wife and I built that porch with our own 2 hands. Dolan leaned forward, dropping his voice, though not far enough. Wren stood 3 tables away and heard every word. "Here's the thing, Earl. That barn of yours failed inspection last spring. I could reopen that file any time I like. Citations pile up fast for a man on a fixed income. That inspection was fine. You know that. I know what the paperwork says I want it to say." Earl's hands resting on the table had begun to shake. Not from fear, exactly. From the particular exhaustion of a man worn down slowly over 2 long years. "You've got until the council vote next week," Dolan said, standing. "Sign by then, or things get complicated." He turned to leave and nearly walked into Wren, standing closer than he expected, coffee pot in hand. "Refill, officer?" she asked. Something in her tone made him pause, calm, too calm, like she had heard something and was choosing to hold on to it for later. "I'm good," Dolan said, and left. Wren set the pot down and walked over to Earl's booth. "You all right?" Earl looked up at her, eyes wet, though he would never admit it out loud. "I've been better," he said. 40 years I drove that grain route. 30 of them with my wife, waiting up every night, kitchen light on. That land is the only piece of her I've got left." Wren sat down across from him, just for a moment, just long enough to matter. "Nobody should lose the last piece of someone they loved," she said, "because a man with a badge decided he wanted it more." Earl studied her face. "You say that like you've lost something too." Wren did not answer right away. "Everybody's lost something, Earl," she finally said. "The question is what you do with what's left." She stood and went back to work. Earl kept watching her the same way he had that first morning, doing that old math again, one more time. The days that followed carried a strange weight, the kind of tension that settles in before a storm nobody has named yet. Wren kept her head down and worked. She learned every regular's name, learned how they liked their eggs, and never once complained about a double shift. But something had shifted in the diner since that Thursday morning. People noticed how Wren had listened while Dolan leaned on Earl. They noticed she had not looked away. In a town that had spent years practicing the art of looking away, that mattered more than anyone said aloud. Dolan noticed too. It bothered him more than he expected. He came in almost every day that week, always with some small test built into an ordinary sentence. He would knock over a napkin dispenser and watch to see if she flinched picking it up. He would fire off sudden questions, hoping to catch her in a lie. "You said you're from around right there." Around where exactly? Around. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving. He tried a different angle one afternoon, leaning against the counter while she restocked the pie case. Most people who move to a town like this are running from something. Bad marriage, debt, maybe worse. Wren did not stop stacking the pie boxes.
And some people move to a town like this, she said, because they're running toward something. Ever consider that? Like what? Peace, maybe. Quiet mornings, a place where the only real worry is whether the coffee's fresh. Dolan laughed short and humorless. There's no peace in this town, not really. That's an odd thing for a police officer to admit. His jaw tightened again. That made twice she had made him feel small in front of witnesses. He did not care for the feeling. Men like Grant Dolan rarely do. He left without another word. That night, alone in the small rented room above the hardware store, Wren sat on the edge of a narrow bed and took something out of her duffel bag. An old watch, military style, the metal band worn smooth from years of use. The face cracked in one corner, a thin line running clean through the number 9, like a scar that never fully closed. She held it in both hands for a long time. If you had been in that room, you might have noticed how her breathing changed while she held it. Slower, measured. A person managing something heavy without letting the weight show on the outside. She did not put it on. She never wore it in public. She simply held it, turned it once in her palm, and set it back on the small table by the bed. Then she switched off the light. Tuesday arrived again, 8 days after Wren's first shift at the Anchor. The morning began ordinary enough. Harold and Dot split their eggs. Ruth ordered her black coffee. Earl sat in his booth, though he looked more tired than usual in a way that worried Peggy. Around 11, the bell over the door rang and Grant Dolan walked in. Something was different this time. He was not smiling. His jaw sat tight and his hand rested on his belt in a way that hushed the whole diner before he even opened his mouth. He had spent the morning at the station reading something that had made him furious. A complaint, not against him directly, but close. Someone had called the county sheriff's office asking questions about a land transfer near Matson's property. Questions Grant Dolan did not want anyone asking. He did not know who made that call, but he had a guess. He walked past the counter, past Earl's booth, and stopped in front of Wren, who was clearing a table near the window. "You call the sheriff's office?" he asked, voice low. Wren set down the plates she was holding, slow and careful. "I don't even know the sheriff's number, officer." "Don't lie to me." "I'm not." "Somebody in this diner made a call this morning about things that are none of their business." The room had gone dead still. Peggy stood frozen behind the counter, dish towel in hand. Harold reached across and took Dot's hand. Earl gripped the edge of his booth. "I've been serving tables since 6 a.m., Wren said, her voice even. "You're welcome to check the schedule." Dolan's hand shifted to his hip. "I don't need to check anything," he said. "I know how this works. New face shows up in town and suddenly people start asking questions they never used to ask. That's not how cause and effect works, officer." It was either the wrong thing to say or exactly the right thing, depending on what happens next in a story like this one. Dolan's face flushed red. In one motion, faster than anyone in that diner expected from a man his size, he drew his service weapon. Someone gasped. Dot let out a small cry. Peggy's hand flew to her mouth. He raised the gun and pressed the barrel against Wren's temple. The diner went utterly still. Even the old refrigerator hum in the kitchen seemed to fade to nothing. "Maybe you and I need to have a real conversation," Dolan said, his voice shaking with rage and something close to adrenaline. "About respect. About knowing your place in a town that doesn't know you." Wren did not move. Her eyes stayed forward, steady, looking past him rather than at him, the way you look at weather instead of a person standing in front of you.
Her hands, still holding the empty plates, did not shake. Not even slightly. That was the detail Peggy would remember most later, telling this story to anyone who asked. Not the gun, not the silence. The fact that this young woman's hands had been perfectly, impossibly still. "You've got a decision to make, officer," Wren said, her voice barely above a whisper, though clear enough to reach the whole room. "You can put that weapon away right now and we can both go back to our day. Or you can keep it pointed at an unarmed woman in front of 11 witnesses and see how that decision follows you for the rest of your life." For 3 long seconds, nobody breathed. Then, slowly, Dolan lowered the gun. He did not apologize. He did not explain himself. He simply holstered the weapon, straightened his jacket, and looked around the room like he was daring someone to speak. Nobody did. "Watch yourself," he said to Wren, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. He walked out, the bell over the door ringing behind him like nothing unusual had happened at all. For a long moment after the door closed, nobody in the diner moved. Then Dot Pemberton began to cry quietly into Harold's shoulder. Ruth Alvarez set down her coffee cup with a hand that would not stop trembling. Peggy came around the counter and put both hands on Wren's shoulders. "Are you all right, honey? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Peggy." "You could have died. Right here, in front of everybody." Wren finally set the plates down on the nearest table and took a slow breath. "I've had worse mornings," she said. It was such an unusual thing to say that Peggy nearly laughed out of sheer disbelief, though laughing felt wrong in a room still ringing with fear. Earl Matson had not moved from his booth. He sat there staring at the spot where Wren had stood, his weathered face giving nothing away. He had just seen something he had not expected to see again. Not in Millhaven. Not in a diner that smelled like coffee and bacon grease. He had watched a person hold perfectly still under the barrel of a gun, not frozen from fear, steady from training. He knew the difference. He had spent enough years around men who came home changed from things they never spoke about. He recognized that particular stillness, the one you only learn somewhere far harder than a small-town diner. He said nothing that afternoon. He paid his bill, left his usual tip, and walked home slower than usual, leaning a little harder on his cane. But that night, in his small house at the edge of town, he sat by the window a long while thinking about a young woman with steady hands and eyes that did not blink. Word travels fast in a town of 1,100 people. By the next morning, everyone in Millhaven had heard some version of what happened at the Anchor. Some versions were accurate. Some had grown the way stories always do, gathering extra danger and extra drama with every retelling. But the core of it stayed the same in every version. A cop had pulled his gun on the new waitress, and she had not backed down. Some whispered that she must be crazy. Others whispered that she must be hiding something, running from a past dangerous enough to let a threat like that roll off her without a flinch. Nobody in town not yet guessed the real answer. At the diner that Wednesday morning, the regulars came in quieter than usual. Harold and Dot held hands across their table instead of splitting their usual plate. Ruth Alvarez brought Wren a small bouquet from her shop, wrapped in brown paper, and did not say much beyond, "You didn't deserve that." Peggy tried twice to ask if Wren wanted to talk about it. Both times, Wren gently steered the conversation back to work. "I appreciate you asking," she said the second time, "but some things are easier carried than explained." Peggy did not push further, but she started watching Wren more closely after that, not with suspicion, with something closer to respect, mixed with worry, mixed with a curiosity she could not quite name. Earl came in at his usual time, 7:15, and settled into his usual booth. When Wren brought his eggs and toast, he looked up at her for a long moment. "You didn't sleep much last night, did you?" he said. "Does it show?" "Only to somebody who knows what not sleeping looks like." Wren allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I've had a lot of practice not sleeping, Earl." He nodded slowly as though he had already suspected as much. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You don't have to answer if you'd rather not." "Go ahead." That thing you did yesterday, standing still like that, that's not something you learn from a rough childhood or a bad marriage.
That's something you learn from training, real training.
Wren was quiet for a moment.
Earl, she finally said, I came to Millhaven to leave certain things behind. Not to erase them, just to set them down for a while.
Fair enough, Earl said. A man's allowed to set things down. He did not ask again, but something had shifted between them, an understanding that did not need words to hold its shape. That Thursday, 2 days after the incident with the gun, Wren finished her shift a little early. Peggy had insisted.
Go get some fresh air, honey. You've been on your feet since sunup.
Wren did not go home right away. She walked instead, unhurried, down Main Street, past the barber shop, past the hardware store where she rented her room, until she reached the small park at the center of town.
It was nothing fancy. A gazebo with peeling white paint, a war memorial listing names from 3 different generations, a few benches facing a fountain that had not run in years. An old woman sat on one of the benches, wrestling with a grocery bag that had torn at the bottom. Cans of soup were rolling across the pavement, one after another, faster than she could catch them. Wren crossed the park without thinking twice and knelt down, gathering the cans before they scattered further.
Thank you, the woman said, breathless. They don't make these bags like they used to.
Nothing does, Wren said, smiling faintly. She held the cans in the crook of one arm.
Where are you headed? I can carry these the rest of the way.
The woman studied her for a moment.
You're the new girl from the diner, the one who stood up to Grant Dolan.
Word had clearly traveled all the way here to a park bench 3 blocks from the anchor.
I just poured coffee, Wren said. That's all. That's not all, and you know it.
The woman's eyes were sharp despite her age.
My name is Loretta. I live 2 streets over. My husband passed last spring and my knees aren't what they used to be. I'm Wren. Let's get you home, Loretta. They walked together slow enough to match Loretta's pace, past small houses with sagging porches and neatly trimmed lawns, past a church with a hand-painted sign advertising a bake sale that weekend. Loretta talked the whole way people do when loneliness has been sitting on them a while and someone finally shows up to listen. She talked about her husband, a mechanic, who had fixed half the cars in Millhaven over 4 decades. She talked about her son, who lived 2 states away and called on Sundays sometimes. She talked about Grant Dolan, too, though she lowered her voice when she did. That boy has been trouble since he was young, Loretta said. His father was worse. Walter Dolan ran this town like it belonged to him for 16 years on that council. People were afraid to cross him, still are, most days.
What changed that?
Loretta shrugged a small, tired gesture. Nothing changed it. That's the trouble. Nobody ever stood up long enough for anything to shift. We just got used to letting it slide.
They reached a small house with blue shutters and a wind chime on the porch.
This is me, Loretta said. Thank you for the company, dear. And thank you for standing up for Earl and for Ruth and for the rest of us who forgot how.
Wren set the grocery bag down gently on the porch step.
I didn't do much. You did something, Loretta said. That's more than most people manage.
Wren walked home slower than usual that evening, turning over how a whole town could learn over years to accept things that never should have been accepted in the first place. How silence, repeated long enough, starts to feel like peace, even when it is really just exhaustion wearing a familiar coat. She thought about her own training a long time ago in circumstances far from this quiet street. About how the hardest lessons were never really about weapons or tactics. They were about knowing when silence had gone on too long and when it was finally time to speak. The days after the gun incident settled into something close to normal, though normal now carried a different texture. Grant Dolan did not come into the diner for 4 straight days, the longest gap anyone could remember since he started demanding free coffee 3 years earlier. When he finally returned on Saturday afternoon, he did not lean on the counter or make demands. He sat quietly at a table near the door, ordered properly, and paid for it before leaving. He did not look at Wren once, but everyone in the diner sensed the story was not finished. Grant Dolan was not a man who let embarrassment go unanswered. He was simply waiting for the right moment.
That moment came the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the first incident, on a slow afternoon, once the lunch rush had thinned. Ruth Alvarez sat near the counter, sipping tea and reading the local paper. A slight tremor lived in her hands, a small sign of age most people in town had learned to work around without comment. Wren was carrying a tray of hot water and tea supplies across the diner, headed for Ruth's table. Grant Dolan walked in at that exact moment. He saw Wren carrying the tray. He saw an opening. Nobody in that diner, not even Peggy, could say for certain afterward whether what happened next was truly an accident or something Dolan decided to make happen in the half-second he had to choose. He stepped sideways, fast, directly into Wren's path. The tray tipped. Scalding water meant for a pot of tea arced through the air toward Ruth Alvarez's exposed hands and face. For most people, this would have ended in a scream, in burned skin, in an ambulance ride and a lawsuit dragging on for months. But Wren's body moved before her mind had finished forming a decision. Her left hand shot out and caught the falling tray by its edge, redirecting the water in a controlled arc away from Ruth entirely, splashing it harmlessly onto the tile floor instead. Her right hand in the same motion guided Ruth's shoulder backward out of range. The whole sequence took less than 1 second. When it was over, Ruth sat stunned but completely unharmed, her tea and newspaper scattered on the table in front of her. The hot water steamed on the floor several feet from where anyone had been standing. Wren stood perfectly still, tray now empty in her hand, breathing normally, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The diner fell silent for the second time in 2 weeks. Grant Dolan stood frozen near the doorway, his expression caught somewhere between shock and something close to fear. "That was clumsy of me," he muttered, though nobody in that room quite believed the word clumsy described what they had just watched. He left quickly, without ordering anything. Ruth Alvarez sat shaking slightly in her chair, more from adrenaline than injury. "How did you—" she started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "How did you do that so fast?" Wren knelt and began mopping up the spilled water, her hands steady again, her expression calm. "Instinct," she said simply. "That's all." "That's not instinct," Earl said from his booth. He had watched the whole thing without moving his coffee, cooling, untouched in front of him. "That's training. I've seen that kind of reflex exactly once before in my life." Wren did not look up from mopping the floor. "Where was that?" Peggy asked, coming around the counter, her voice careful. Earl was quiet, a long moment, staring at the wet spot on the floor as though the memory itself needed time to surface. "A long time ago," he finally said, "I had a nephew who came home from overseas different than he'd left. Quiet, like our Wren here. Steady hands even when everything around him was falling apart. He used to say the training never really leaves you. It just waits." The diner sat with that for a moment, absorbing what Earl had said and what he had not. Wren finished cleaning the floor and stood, setting the empty tray on the counter. "Your nephew sounds like he understood something most people never have to learn," she said. "He did," Earl said. "Cost him plenty to learn it, though." Something passed between Wren and Earl in that moment. Not a confession, exactly, not a confirmation either, just two people recognizing the shape of a similar weight, even without naming it out loud. Ruth reached out and took Wren's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "Whatever that was, whatever you did, you saved me from a very bad afternoon." "You don't have to thank me," Wren said. "I just did what needed doing." "That's usually when thanks matter most," Ruth said, "when someone does the right thing without waiting to be asked." Harold Pemberton cleared his throat. "I've lived in this town 63 years, he said. "I've watched a lot happen at that counter. Never once seen anything like what you just did." "It was 1 second, Harold Wren said. "Barely worth mentioning." "1 second is usually all it takes," Harold said, "good or bad. Nobody tells you that when you're young. Life doesn't ask permission before it changes. It just happens fast, and you either meet it or you don't." Dot squeezed her husband's hand. "He gets philosophical after lunch," she said, smiling faintly at Wren. "But he's not wrong this time." Peggy came around with a fresh towel and finished wiping down the last of the water, though the floor was already mostly clean.
"I think we could all use a slow afternoon after that," she said. "Coffee's on the house. Every table."
A few tired laughs moved through the diner, the kind that come after fear has passed and people need somewhere to put the leftover adrenaline. Wren carried the empty tray back to the kitchen, and for a moment, alone behind the swinging door, she let herself close her eyes and breathe.
Nobody saw that moment except the old refrigerator humming in the corner and the afternoon light slanting through the small window above the sink. It was enough, for now, that nobody had gotten hurt. It was enough that Ruth Alvarez would go home tonight with nothing worse than a good story to tell. She had learned a long time ago not to ask for more than that, not to expect gratitude or explanation or peace that lasted longer than a single afternoon. She simply did what needed doing and moved on to the next table. That night, after the diner closed and Peggy had locked the front door, Wren walked the 2 blocks back to her small rented room above the hardware store. The town had gone still in the particular way small towns settle after dark. Porch lights glowing here and there, the distant hum of a television through an open window, a dog barking once, then quieting. She climbed the narrow staircase, unlocked her door, and set her bag down by the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress a long while before reaching for the small table beside it. The watch waited exactly where she had left it. Cracked face, worn band, a thin scar running through the number 9. She picked it up, turned it once in her palm, and held it against her chest for a moment, eyes closed. If you had asked her, in that small room, what she was thinking about, she might not have had an easy answer. Some memories refuse to arrange themselves into simple sentences. They just sit in your chest, heavy and familiar, like an old friend who visits without calling first. She thought about a person she used to know, someone who had given her this watch once, a long time ago, in a place far from Millhaven, under circumstances she rarely let herself remember in detail. She thought about promises made in difficult moments, about the particular hush that follows a person home after certain experiences, one that never fully leaves, no matter how many small towns you move to or how many diner shifts you work. She thought about Earl and the way his eyes had understood something about her without needing an explanation. She thought about a gun pressed against her temple and the strange small mercy of having learned long ago how to hold still when everything in you wanted to move. Outside, somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed. A dog barked twice this time, then settled. Wren opened her eyes, set the watch gently back on the table, and did not put it on. Not yet. She was not ready for Millhaven to know the whole story, not yet. But something had already begun shifting in this small town, whether she wanted it to or not. A cop with too much power had drawn his weapon in front of 11 witnesses. A community that had spent years staying quiet was starting slowly to watch more closely. And an old veteran named Earl Matson had started doing math in his head again. Old math, about a young woman whose hands did not shake even when a gun was pressed to her skull. Somewhere out there, beyond the edges of this small town, there were people who still remembered her real name. People who knew exactly what 15 years of service had cost her and exactly what she had walked away from to find a quiet town like this one. They were not far away. Not really. And they were about to become very important to the story unfolding in Millhaven. But that part had not started yet. For now, there was only a small room above a hardware store, a cracked watch resting on a bedside table, and a young woman, finally, carefully letting herself fall asleep. Tomorrow the diner would open again at 6 a.m. Tomorrow she would pour coffee from clear tables and remember exactly how everyone liked their eggs. She did not know yet how much everything was about to change. How the peace she had come looking for was about to be tested in ways far larger than one gun in one diner on one ordinary Tuesday. But for tonight at least, she let herself rest. There is a lesson tucked inside this part of the story, if you are willing to sit with it a moment longer. Most of us go through life believing strength looks a certain way. Loud,
sudden, impossible to miss. Real strength, the kind that actually holds a room together, often looks like something much smaller. A steady hand, a calm answer, a woman kneeling down to gather spilled cans of soup for a stranger on a park bench. Wren Calloway did not come to Millhaven looking for a fight. She came looking for quiet mornings and honest work for a town small enough that nobody would ask too many questions. But somewhere along the way, without ever raising her voice, she had already started reminding an entire community of something it had let itself forget. That dignity is not something you ask permission for. That an old man's land is worth defending.
That an elderly woman deserves to sit at a diner counter without fearing what might come flying at her next. These are not small lessons. They rarely are. Earl Natson understood this better than most, lying awake that night in his small house at the edge of town, listening to the wind move through trees his wife had planted 30 years earlier. He thought about his nephew and about the particular hush that follows a person home from difficult places. He thought about a young woman with steady hands and wondered how much weight she was carrying and how long she had carried it alone. He made a decision that night, lying there in the dark. Whatever came next for Wren Calloway in this town, whatever trouble Loretta had spoken of without naming it directly, he would not look away this time. He had looked away for 2 years while the Dolans tightened their grip on Millhaven. He would not look away again. Tomorrow the diner would open at 6 a.m., same as always. Tomorrow Wren would pour coffee, clear tables, and remember exactly how everyone liked their eggs. But something in Millhaven had already shifted quietly, the way seasons turn before anyone notices the first cold morning. A cop with too much power had drawn his weapon in front of 11 witnesses, and an entire town had watched a stranger refuse to be afraid. That kind of moment does not simply disappear. It sits in a town's memory, waiting for the next thing to happen. And in Millhaven, the next thing was already on its way. Small towns rarely announce their turning points in advance. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary Tuesdays, ordinary diners, ordinary strangers stepping off an ordinary bus with nothing but a duffel bag and a face nobody recognized. Millhaven would not recognize, not yet that its turning point had already walked through the door of the Anchor Diner a week earlier, asking about a help wanted sign. It would take a few more weeks before the town understood what it had actually been given. A chance to remember something about itself that 2 years of quiet fear had nearly worn away entirely. The simple, stubborn belief that neighbors look out for neighbors, no matter who wears the badge and no matter how long the silence has lasted. Earl Matson would carry that thought with him into the days ahead, through paperwork he still had not signed, through a council vote still looming on the calendar, through a friendship with a quiet young woman that would ask more of him than he expected and give him back more than he ever thought he had left to give. Peggy Sullivan would carry it too, behind her counter pouring coffee for a town that was slowly, carefully learning to look each other in the eye again. And somewhere, above a hardware store, in a small rented room with creaky floors, a woman with 15 years of service folded quietly into her past would sleep a little easier that night. Not because the danger had passed, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not the only one standing guard. Some men learn from being embarrassed. Grant Dolan was not one of them. The week after the gun incident, and the day after the spilled tray of scalding water, something in him had started to curdle. Not shame. Something closer to resentment, the kind that grows quietly in a man who has never once had to answer for his mistakes. He had been humiliated twice in front of witnesses by a waitress with no last name he trusted and no past he could find. It sat wrong in his chest. He was not a man who liked sitting with things that felt wrong. And when men like Grant Dolan feel wronged, they tend to go looking for someone to blame. That search would lead him somewhere dark. It would lead an entire town closer to a truth that had been sitting under Millhaven's surface for years, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to dig it up. But first, there was a council vote coming,
and there was land that needed signing over before anyone had time to ask too many questions. Walter Dolan's house sat on the nicest street in Millhaven, the only one with sidewalks on both sides and streetlights that actually worked at night. He had been Councilman Dolan for 16 years before stepping down, though everyone still called him that out of habit. He was 71 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of handshake that felt warm right up until you noticed how hard he was squeezing. His son sat across from him at the kitchen table that Friday evening, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. "You let a waitress make you look like a fool," Walter said. "Twice, from what I hear. It won't happen again." "It already happened twice, Grant. There's no version of that sentence that sounds good." Grant's jaw tightened, the same tell he had carried since he was a boy losing arguments at this exact table. "I've got it handled." Walter leaned back in his chair, studying his son the way a man studies a tool he no longer fully trusts. "We have 1 week until the council vote," he said. 1 week to get Matson's signature and the Kowalski parcel and Loretta Boyd's half-acre behind the church. That land needs locking up before Riverside Development sends their people down here to survey it. I'm working on it, not fast enough. Half this town watched you draw your weapon on an unarmed woman over coffee and gossip. That's not the attention we need right now, son. "She's hiding something," Grant said. "I can feel it. Nobody just walks into a town like this without a past." Walter waved a hand, dismissive. "Everybody's got a past. That's not the problem. The problem is you keep letting one waitress pull your focus off the actual work in front of us." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were 3 names, 3 addresses, 3 small parcels of land that together formed a strip along the old river frontage at the edge of town. Land worth almost nothing for decades, until a development company 2 states over decided it wanted to build vacation cabins where cornfields used to sit. "Earl Matson Walter said," tapping the first page. "Loretta Boyd. And the Kowalski place, though old Stan passed last winter, so that's just his daughter now, living 3 counties away and barely paying attention. That one should be easy. And if they don't sign?" Walter's expression did not change. "Then you find a reason they need to sign. Citations, inspections, whatever it takes to make holding on to that land feel more expensive than letting it go." Grant looked down at the folder, at Earl Matson's name typed neatly across the top of the first page. Something flickered across his face, quick and small. Gone before it could grow into anything worth naming. "I'll handle it," he said again, harder this time. Walter nodded, satisfied, and poured himself another drink. Neither man noticed the kitchen window had been left open a crack, a breeze carrying their voices out into the evening street. Not that it mattered. Nobody was outside to hear it. Not yet. Earl Matson had not slept well in 3 nights. He sat in his kitchen that Monday morning staring at a stack of paperwork spread across the table where his wife used to set breakfast every day for 30 years. The papers wanted his signature. A land transfer agreement dense with legal language he only partly understood, offering a number that looked fair until you weighed it against what a company willing to pay real money for river frontage actually thought that land was worth. He had until Friday, the council vote. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, and set it down without refilling it. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. At 7:15, he walked to the diner, same as always, and slid into his usual booth by the window. Wren brought his eggs and toast without him asking. "You look like you didn't sleep, Earl." "Didn't sleep much, no." "Want to talk about it?" He turned his fork over in his hands a long moment before answering. "You ever have to choose between the last thing you've got left of someone you loved and just making your life easier?" Wren set down the coffee pot and slid into the booth across from him the way she had once before. "I've had to choose between harder things than that, Earl." "Doesn't make this one feel small." "No," she agreed. "It wouldn't." He told her finally what he had kept close for 2 years, the citations that appeared whenever he was slow to agree to something, the way Grant Dolan had started dropping by more often after his wife passed, always friendly at first, always circling back to the same subject eventually. The offer on the table now, the deadline, the threat wrapped inside legal language that almost made it sound reasonable. They want the whole strip along the river, Earl said. Me and Loretta Boyd behind the church and the Kowalski place, 3 parcels side by side. Somebody's building something out there, cabins maybe, rich folks from the city wanting a view.
Wren listened without interrupting, her face steady, though something behind her eyes had sharpened. And if you don't sign, then Grant finds a reason my barn fails inspection again. Or my truck gets impounded over some violation nobody can quite explain. Small things at first. They add up faster than you'd think on a fixed income. That's coercion, Earl, not negotiation.
Feels like it, he said. Hard to prove, though, especially when the man doing the coercing wears a badge and his father used to run the town council. Wren was quiet a moment, thinking. You said Loretta Boyd is on that list too, and the Kowalski place. Stan's daughter, living 3 counties over, probably doesn't even know what's happening yet.
Wren thought of the woman she had walked home a few days earlier gathering spilled cans of soup on a park bench. A widow with sharp eyes and a house with blue shutters. I met her, Wren said. Loretta. She helped me understand a few things about this town.
She's a good woman, Earl said. Deserves better than what's coming for her. Wren stood gathering the coffee pot again, but before she left the booth, she looked back at him. Don't sign anything yet, Earl. Not until we understand exactly what's really happening here. You're not carrying this alone anymore, she said. Not if I can help it. Earl watched her walk away, and for the first time in 2 years, something in his chest loosened.
Not hope. Something smaller and more fragile, but real all the same.
He thought, watching her disappear into the kitchen, about the strange comfort of no longer being the only person in a room willing to say a hard thing out loud. For 2 years, that particular loneliness had sat heavier on him than the mortgage papers ever could. It was not the threats that had worn him down the most. It was carrying them alone, certain nobody else in Millhaven would believe him or care enough to help if they did. Now at least there was one more person willing to look the problem straight in the eye instead of around it. It was not much, but after 2 years of very little, it felt like something worth holding on to. Loretta Boyd called Earl again that same afternoon, her voice tighter than before. He came back, she said. Left a citation on my door this time. Says my porch railing is a safety hazard. Gives me 30 days to fix it or pay a fine I can't afford. That railing's been fine for 20 years, Loretta. I know that. You know that. Doesn't seem to matter what we know. Earl carried that conversation with him to the diner the next morning, sharing it with Wren over a cup of coffee that had gone cold while they talked. It's not just land they're after, Earl said. It's wearing people down until giving up feels easier than fighting. I've watched it happen to 3 other families over the years. Quiet folks. Older folks. People who didn't have anybody willing to make noise on their behalf. What happened to them? 2 of them sold and moved on. One family just left town altogether, packed up in the middle of the night without so much as a goodbye to the neighbors. Nobody ever talked about why. We all just assumed they had their reasons.
Wren set down her coffee cup carefully. That's not assuming, Earl. That's choosing not to ask a question you already suspected the answer to.
Earl looked at her for a long moment, something uncomfortable crossing his weathered face. You're not wrong, he admitted. This town got very good at not asking questions. Took a stranger with a duffel bag to remind us what asking even sounds like. I'm not trying to remind anyone of anything, Earl. I just don't like watching people get pushed around. Maybe that's the same thing in the end, Earl said. You don't have to mean to be a reminder. Sometimes it just happens because somebody finally stood still long enough for the rest of us to notice what we'd stopped seeing. Wren considered that, turning it over the way she turned over most things slowly without rushing toward an answer. 3 families, she said. That's not bad luck, Earl. That's a pattern, and patterns can be proven if somebody's willing to look closely enough. You planning on looking? I'm planning on making sure somebody does, whether that's me or Sheriff Callahan or anybody else this town still trusts enough to listen to. Earl nodded slowly, something steadying behind his tired eyes. There aren't many of those left, he said. People this town still trusts, I mean, but there's a few. More than there used to be now that you're here. By Wednesday, 2 days before the council vote, Grant Dolan's patience had run out entirely. He had visited Loretta Boyd the day before, standing on her porch with the blue shutters, explaining in careful, polite language exactly how expensive it might become for a widow living alone if certain code violations were discovered on her property.
Loretta had not signed.
She had simply thanked him for stopping by, closed her door gently, and called Earl Matson the moment he was gone.
"They came for me, too," she told him. "Same as you. Same deadline."
Earl relayed this to Wren the next morning at the diner, keeping his voice low, though the breakfast crowd had thinned enough that privacy was not hard to find.
3 parcels,
Wren said, more to herself than to him.
all connected, all tied to the same deadline. This isn't random harassment, Earl. This is a plan.
What do we do?
For now, nothing that draws attention. Let me think.
Thinking takes time, and time was the one thing Grant Dolan had decided to stop giving anyone. That same Wednesday afternoon, a different kind of trouble arrived at the Anchor Diner, one that had nothing to do with land, or at least appeared that way at first. Peggy kept a small donation box near the register, decorated with a faded photo of a local family whose house had burned down 2 winters earlier. Customers dropped in spare change and folded bills, and every few months, Peggy counted it out and delivered it personally to whichever family in town needed it most. The box had held nearly $400 as of Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, when Peggy checked it before closing, the box sat almost empty. Less than $30 remained, loose change rattling at the bottom.
"That can't be right,"
Peggy said, counting it twice, then a third time, her hands beginning to shake.
"There should be almost $400 in here."
She looked around the diner at the handful of regulars finishing their coffee, at Wren wiping down the counter near the pie case. Nobody said anything at first. Then Peggy's eyes landed almost by accident on Wren, and something shifted in her expression before she caught herself and looked away. Wren noticed. She had spent years learning to notice exactly that kind of small, involuntary shift in another person's face.
"Peggy,"
she said carefully. "You don't think—" "No," Peggy said quickly. Too quickly. "Of course not. I'm sure there's an explanation." But the seed had already dropped, and seeds like that grow fast in a town primed for suspicion by a stranger who had arrived less than 2 weeks earlier with 1 duffel bag and no explanation for where she came from. By Thursday morning, the story had started spreading. A whisper at the hardware store, a comment at the church bake sale, someone mentioning almost in passing that the new girl at the diner had access to that donation box every single day. Wren heard none of it directly. She simply noticed, over the course of Thursday, that a few regulars seemed a little cooler than usual, a little less willing to meet her eyes when she refilled their coffee. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that explaining yourself too quickly before you understand what you are actually defending against rarely helps. She did not yet know that Grant Dolan had started the whisper himself, that he had mentioned it almost casually to 3 different people around town and let the story do the rest of the work on its own. He had learned that trick from his father. You did not need to prove something in a small town. You just needed to say it loud enough to enough people and let silence carry it the rest of the way. Friday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching the mood settled over Millhaven without anyone quite naming why. The council vote was scheduled for that evening. Earl still had not signed. Loretta still had not signed. The Kowalski daughter, 3 counties away, had not returned a single phone call. Grant Dolan walked into the Anchor Diner at 11:15 exactly as he had 2 weeks earlier, though this time his expression carried none of the earlier smugness. This time he looked like a man who had run out of patience and out of time and had decided the 2 problems in front of him, the land and the waitress, could somehow be solved in a single move. He did not stop at the counter. He walked straight to where Wren stood clearing a table near the window, the same window where Ruth Alvarez had nearly been burned by scalding water 10 days earlier. "Wren Calloway," he said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "I need you to come with me." Wren set down the dishes she was holding, slow and deliberate. "On what grounds, officer? Theft." Nearly $400 missing from the donation box in this diner, and you're the only new employee with access to it. Peggy, frozen behind the counter, opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, torn between defending Wren and the very real fear of what could happen to her business license if she pushed back too hard against a Dolan.
I didn't touch that box, Wren said, calm but firm. That's not what 3 witnesses in this town are saying. Which 3 witnesses?
Dolan did not answer. He reached for the handcuffs at his belt, the metal catching the gray light through the window. Hands behind your back! The diner went completely still. The same hush Wren remembered from 2 weeks earlier, though this time it felt different.
This time it felt like something the whole town had been quietly bracing for without knowing what shape it would take.
Wren did not resist. She turned slowly, placing her hands behind her back, her face unreadable.
"You're making a mistake," she said, not pleading, simply stating a fact.
"We'll let a judge decide that." He clicked the cuffs shut, tighter than necessary, and in turning her toward the door, his hand caught the edge of her sleeve, dragging it up. The old watch-cracked face and worn band slipped loose and fell to the tile floor with a small, sharp sound. For a fraction of a second, something crossed Wren's face. Not panic. Something closer to grief, quick and quiet, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Grant Dolan looked down at the watch on the floor, then back up at Wren, his expression hardening further.
"What's this evidence you're trying to hide?" "It's not evidence of anything," Wren said. "It's mine." He stepped forward, whether from genuine anger or simple cruelty meant to make a point, in front of the room, and brought his boot down on the watch, hard. The old glass cracked further under the pressure. The worn band snapped clean in half.
Someone in the diner gasped. Dot Pemberton put a hand to her mouth. Wren's eyes dropped to the broken pieces on the floor for just a moment. Then she looked back up at Grant Dolan, and whatever crossed her face in that instant was enough to make even him take half a step back.
"You didn't need to do that,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Move," Dolan said, grabbing her arm and steering her toward the door.
Earl Matson had watched the whole thing unfold from his booth by the window, unable to move, unable to speak, his hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough to turn his knuckles pale. He had spent 2 years watching Grant Dolan slowly tighten his grip on this town and had done nothing except grow tired and quiet and small. But watching that watch shatter on the tile floor, watching the same young woman who had caught a tray of scalding water to protect Ruth Alvarez get led out in handcuffs over a lie he was already certain was exactly that, something in Earl Matson finally broke loose. He stood slower than he used to, his cane knocking against the table leg. "Grant," he said, his voice louder than anyone in the diner had heard it in years. "This is wrong, and you know it." Dolan paused at the door, Wren still cuffed beside him. "Sit down, Earl. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Earl said. "You've been squeezing this town for 2 years. Citations that don't hold up. Inspections that change depending on your mood. And now, you're going to stand there and tell me a woman who just saved Ruth from getting burned alive is a thief? The evidence says otherwise. The evidence says whatever you and your father need it to say." The diner had gone utterly silent, everyone watching Earl Matson, 78 years old, leaning on his cane, saying out loud what half this town had been thinking privately for 2 years, but never dared to speak. Dolan's jaw tightened. "Careful, old man. I'm done being careful," Earl said. "I've been careful for 2 years, and all it's gotten me is a stack of papers on my kitchen table telling me to sign away the last thing my wife and I ever built together." He looked around the diner, at Peggy, at Ruth, at Harold, and Dot, at every familiar face that had shared this space with him for years. "How many of you got a visit this week?" he asked. "How many of you got told your inspection might fail or your permit might get pulled right before a council vote that decides whether some development company gets our riverland for pennies on the dollar?" Nobody answered right away, but the silence itself was an answer, heavy and uncomfortable, settling over the room like a held breath finally let go. Loretta Boyd, who had come in for her usual afternoon tea and watched the last several minutes in stunned silence, spoke up quietly from her seat near the counter.
He came to my house Tuesday, she said. Same conversation, same deadline.
Dolan's face flushed red, caught between fury and the sudden awareness that this conversation was happening in front of far too many witnesses.
"This isn't the time," he said, and pulled Wren toward the door.
"When is the time, Grant?" Earl called after him. "When exactly is the right time to talk about what your family's been doing to this town?" Dolan did not answer. The bell over the door rang as he pulled Wren outside the diner, falling into a heavy, stunned silence behind them.
Peggy knelt down and gathered the broken pieces of the watch from the floor, cradling them in her palm. "I should have said something a long time ago,"
Earl said, still standing, his hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading.
"You did the right thing," Peggy said, though her voice shook. "Grant's not going to forget this, though. Any of it."
"Let him remember," Earl said. "I'm tired of being the only one who does." Ruth Alvarez came around the counter and set a gentle hand on Earl's shoulder.
"We should have said something years ago," she said. "All of us. We just let it happen year after year because it was easier than the alternative."
"It's not too late," Earl said.
"It can't be too late. Not now."
Peggy wrapped the broken watch pieces carefully in a paper napkin and set them behind the counter in the drawer where she kept the diner's more important papers safe from further damage. Within an hour, word of the arrest had spread through Millhaven faster than anything since the gun incident 2 weeks earlier. Some versions painted Wren as guilty, a con artist finally caught. Other versions, especially among those who had witnessed the scene firsthand, told a very different story. A story about a small town finally starting to notice a pattern that had been sitting in plain sight for years. That evening, the council vote proceeded as scheduled, though the room felt tenser than usual. Several members glancing nervously toward the back where Walter Dolan sat, silver-haired and composed, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Nobody mentioned the arrest directly during the meeting, but everyone had heard about it, and everyone understood without needing to say it aloud that the timing was no coincidence. Earl Matson had still not signed his papers. Loretta Boyd had still not signed hers. The Kowalski daughter remained unreachable 3 counties away. The vote on the Riverland rezoning was tabled for 1 more week, giving the Dolans a narrow window to close the remaining deals, a narrow window that had just gotten significantly more complicated. That same evening, while the council vote was still underway, Grant Dolan stopped by the Anchor Diner 1 more time. Peggy was closing up alone, the last customers gone, the lights dimmed except for the one above the register. He did not sit down. He stood near the door, hat in his hands, playing a role he had clearly rehearsed on the drive over.
"Peggy," he said, "I need to talk to you about your employee."
"She's not my employee right now," Peggy said carefully. "She's in your custody."
"That's exactly my point.
Until this theft investigation clears up, it wouldn't look good for your business to keep her on staff. Health department could take an interest. Liability concerns, that sort of thing."
Peggy stood very still behind the counter, understanding exactly what he was really saying.
"You're threatening my diner license." "I'm not threatening anything," Dolan said, his voice smooth in the way that made the threat land harder than shouting would have. "I'm just letting you know how these things tend to go when a business doesn't cooperate with an active investigation." Peggy thought about 22 years of running this place alone since her husband passed. About every regular who depended on this diner staying open every single morning. About Harold and Dot and their one shared plate of eggs. About Earl and his booth by the window. She thought about Wren, steady-handed, quietly kind. Someone Peggy had come to trust in less than 2 weeks, in a way she rarely trusted anyone that fast.
"If I suspend her," Peggy said slowly, "it's temporary. Until this gets sorted out properly, not permanent."
"Whatever helps you sleep at night, Peggy." He tipped his hat, a small mocking gesture, and left without waiting for a response. Peggy stood alone in the empty diner a long time after he left, staring at the register, at the small paper napkin tucked safely in the drawer beneath it, wrapped around the broken pieces of a watch that had meant something she still did not fully understand.
She hated herself a little making that call.
But she also understood, with the clarity that comes from running a small business for over 2 decades, exactly how quickly everything she had built could disappear if she pushed back too hard, too fast, without more people standing beside her. She would find a way to make it right. She promised herself that, locking the front door behind her, the bell ringing softly in the empty diner. She just did not know yet how soon that chance would come. Wren spent that night in the small holding cell at the Millhaven police station, the only cell the tiny department maintained, usually reserved for the occasional drunk driver or teenager caught vandalizing the water tower. She sat on the thin cot, elbows resting on her knees, and did not sleep. She was not afraid. Fear was a feeling she had learned a long time ago to set aside once it stopped being useful. What she felt instead was closer to calculation, the familiar process of assessing a situation and deciding what came next. She thought about Earl standing up in that diner, his voice shaking with something braver than fear. She thought about the watch, broken, now resting somewhere behind Peggy's counter in pieces. She thought about the years before Millhaven, about training that had taught her to hold steady under far worse pressure than a small-town jail cell, about people she had once served alongside who would not have hesitated even for a second to come stand beside her now if they knew where she was. Around midnight, she heard the front door of the station open, low voices in the front room, too far off to make out clearly. She recognized one voice immediately, despite not having heard it in over a year. A woman's voice, calm and measured, carrying itself the way people do when they are used to being underestimated in rooms full of men and used to proving them wrong anyway. Wren sat up straight on the cot, listening. "I need to speak with Sheriff Callahan," the voice said. "Tonight. It's important." There was a pause, some shuffling, the creak of an office chair, then a man's voice, older, tired-sounding, but not unkind. "I'm Callahan. What can I do for you at this hour?" "My name is Cassidy Rourke," the woman said. "And I believe you're holding someone in your custody who has nothing to do with the theft you're investigating." "And how would you know that?" "Because I served 15 years alongside her," Cassidy said. "And because I have something in this envelope you're going to want to hear before anyone else touches this case." Wren closed her eyes in the dark cell, something in her chest loosening for the first time in hours. She had not called anyone. She had not reached out, not once, since arriving in Millhaven. She had wanted more than anything to leave that whole part of her life quietly behind her. But apparently, some people did not let you disappear that easily, even when you asked them to. Not when it mattered. Sheriff Dale Callahan had served as the top law enforcement officer for the county surrounding Millhaven for nearly 20 years, though his jurisdiction rarely overlapped with the small town's own police department, except in serious matters. He was 63 years old, gray at the temples, with the tired, careful eyes of a man who had spent 2 decades trying to keep peace in a region where peace sometimes meant looking the other way longer than he was comfortable with. He had heard rumors about the Dolans for years. Small things, mostly. Complaints that never quite added up to anything actionable. Citations that seemed to target certain residents more than others. He had never had proof. Proof was the difference between rumor and action, and in a county this small, rumor without proof could end a career faster than the corruption itself. He studied the woman standing in his office at nearly midnight, dressed plainly, but carrying herself with the same unmistakable bearing he had seen in every serious military professional he had met over his years of service. "You said you served with the woman we're holding," he said. 15 years, you said?" 15 years, Cassidy confirmed. "We came up together, trained together. There isn't a mission I went on in the last decade of my service where I didn't trust her with my life more than once." "And what exactly is in this envelope, Ms. Rourke?" Cassidy set the envelope on his desk unopened. "A recording," she said. "Officer Dolan called me 3 days ago trying to dig up information about Wren's background. He wasn't subtle about it. He threatened to make things difficult for a mutual friend of ours, still stationed overseas, if I didn't cooperate." "He threatened a service member?" "Indirectly. Clearly enough that I recorded the whole call, every word." Callahan opened the envelope carefully, finding a small digital recorder inside, along with a printed transcript. "Why record it in the first place? Because men like Grant Dolan," Cassidy said, "tend to reveal exactly who they are the moment they think nobody important is listening." Callahan pressed play, and Grant Dolan's voice filled the quiet office, unmistakably arrogant, careless in the way people become when they have never once faced real consequences. The recording ran nearly 4 minutes. In it, Dolan asked increasingly aggressive questions about Wren's service record, her reasons for leaving, whether she had documented psychological issues he could use against her credibility in town. When Cassidy refused to answer, the recording caught Dolan's tone shifting sharper, meaner, threatening, consequences for a soldier he named directly, a man currently deployed and completely unaware his name was being used as leverage against him. Callahan listened to the whole thing twice, his expression growing more troubled with each pass. "This is a federal matter," he finally said. "Threatening a service member, even indirectly, crosses a line I can't ignore." "I know," Cassidy said. "That's why I came straight to you instead of anyone in Millhaven's own department." Callahan sat back, rubbing his eyes with one hand. 20 years I've heard whispers about that family," he said. 20 years, and nobody ever brought me something I could actually use. You have it now." He looked up at her. "Tell me about her," he said. "The woman in my holding cell. Tell me who Wren Calloway really is." Cassidy took a moment, choosing her words with care.
"She's the reason I'm alive," she finally said. "She's the reason 3 other people I served with are alive. 15 years, Sheriff. 15 years of service most people will never understand and never should have to. She came to a town like this looking for exactly one thing."
"What's that?"
"A place quiet enough that nobody would ask her to be a hero again."
Callahan glanced toward the small hallway leading back to the holding cells, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "Well," he said slowly, standing up from his desk, "looks like this town had other plans." He walked back to the holding cell alone, keys in hand, leaving Cassidy waiting in his office. Wren looked up as he approached, her face calm, unreadable in the dim light.
"Sheriff Callahan," she said, "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," he said, unlocking the cell door. "Though it sounds like I owe you an apology on behalf of a department that should have looked closer at this town a long time ago."
Wren stepped out slowly, rolling her shoulders, once the only outward sign of the tension she had carried for hours.
"Am I free to go?"
"You are. The theft charge doesn't hold up. Peggy's already confirmed the donation box discrepancy doesn't line up with when you had access, and frankly, I've just heard something that makes me far more concerned about Officer Dolan than about missing charity money." He led her back toward the front office where Cassidy stood waiting. The 2 women looked at each other for a long moment, neither speaking right away. 15 years of shared history does not need an opening line.
"You didn't have to come,"
Wren finally said.
"You didn't have to disappear,"
Cassidy replied. "But here we both are." Wren almost smiled, a small, tired expression that carried more warmth than a full grin might have.
"How did you know where I was?"
"I didn't. Not exactly. Not until Dolan called me trying to dig up dirt. The moment he said Millhaven, I knew where you'd landed. You always did like small towns with good coffee and quiet mornings."
"It was quiet," Wren said, "for about 2 weeks.
Callahan cleared his throat gently. "I'll need a formal statement from both of you," he said, "and I intend to open an investigation into Officer Dolan's conduct, effective immediately. Threatening a currently deployed service member, coercion, likely falsifying official citations. This goes well beyond a bad attitude at a diner counter." "What about the land?" Wren asked. "The parcels he's been pressuring people to sign over." Callahan's expression darkened further. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." By the time Wren walked out of the small police station, the sky outside had begun to lighten pale gray, stretching over Millhaven's empty streets. Cassidy walked beside her, hands in her jacket pockets, matching her pace, without needing to be asked. "You look tired," Cassidy said.
"I've had worse nights."
I remember a few of them. They walked in easy silence for a while past the hardware store, past the barber shop, the town slowly waking around them, porch lights clicking off one by one. "Thank you," Wren finally said, "for coming. You don't have to thank me. You know that. I do anyway."
Cassidy glanced sideways at her.
"You gonna tell them?" she asked. "This town? Who you really are? What you actually did for 15 years?
Wren watched the sun begin to climb over the grain silo at the edge of town. "I didn't come here to be known," she said. "I came here to be quiet." "Quiet's not really an option anymore," Cassidy said gently.
"Not after tonight. Not after what that man did to you in front of a diner full of witnesses."
Wren thought about Earl standing on trembling legs to defend her, about Loretta admitting in front of everyone that she had been threatened too, about the watch broken, now sitting in pieces behind Peggy's counter. "Maybe not," she said, "but there's a difference between being known and being used as a symbol."
"I'm not interested in being a symbol, Cassidy. I just want to help these people keep what's theirs."
Cassidy nodded slowly, understanding something in that statement that went deeper than the words themselves. "You always were like that," she said, "even back then. Half the unit wanted commendations pinned to their chests. You just wanted to make sure everyone got home.
Getting people home was the only part that ever mattered."
"I know. I remember." Cassidy kicked a small stone off the sidewalk, watching it skitter into the grass. "You disappeared without a word, though. No forwarding address, no calls. Took me the better part of a year to stop expecting you to show up somewhere." "I needed the quiet to be real," Wren said. "Not something I was performing for people who still expected the old version of me." "And is it real, I mean?" Wren considered the question honestly. "It was for about 2 weeks," she said. "Then a man pointed a gun at my head over coffee and everything got complicated again." Cassidy laughed short and surprised, the sound cutting through the heavy morning air.
"Sounds about right," she said.
"Trouble always did know how to find you, even when you weren't looking for it." They reached the edge of the diner's parking lot, the anchor's windows dark, the closed sign still hanging in the door. "I should get some rest," Wren said. "Diner opens at 6 whether I slept or not." "You're still going to work today?"
"After everything. Especially after everything," Wren said. "People need their coffee, Cassidy. Some things don't stop just because the world got complicated overnight."
Cassidy smiled, a real one this time, tired but genuine. "Same old Wren," she said, "steady as ever." "Someone has to be," Wren said, "in a town like this." "For what it's worth," Cassidy added, "the version of you that helps quietly, without needing credit for it, that's always been the version I respected most."
Wren turned toward the stairs leading up to her small rented room, pausing once to look back.
"You're not leaving town yet, are you?" "Not until this is finished," Cassidy said. "Whatever finished ends up looking like." Wren nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude that carried more weight than any words could have managed after the night they had both just lived through. She climbed the stairs slowly, meaning to rest before her shift began. Halfway up, she noticed a figure waiting near the diner's back entrance below and paused. It was Peggy, still in yesterday's apron, clearly having not slept either, arms crossed against the early morning chill. Wren came back down. "You didn't have to wait out here," she said. "I did, actually." Peggy's voice was rough, worn down by exhaustion and something closer to shame. "I suspended you last night. Grant came by, threatened my license, and I took the easy way out instead of standing beside you the way you'd have stood beside me." "You have a business to protect, Peggy. A whole town depends on this diner staying open."
That's not an excuse, not really.
Peggy looked down at her hands. "I've watched that family squeeze this town smaller for 2 years, and I never said a word. Then you show up, and in 2 weeks you push back more than the rest of us managed in years. First real test I get? I fold." Wren studied her for a long moment. "You're standing here right now telling me the truth instead of avoiding me," she said. "That counts for something. Does it?" It's usually where these things start. Peggy wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the sudden tears, and pulled a fresh apron from her bag. "Shift starts in an hour," she said, holding it out. "If you'll still have it."
Wren took the apron gently.
"Wouldn't miss it," she said. "People need their coffee." They walked together to the front door, unlocked it, and flipped the sign from closed to open, the small bell ringing softly into the quiet morning air. Some things, once broken, could still be repaired if enough people cared enough to try. The small table beside her bed sat empty later that morning, after her shift finally ended. No watch resting there waiting to be held. Just an empty space where something important used to sit, broken now, but not entirely gone. She thought of Peggy, carefully wrapping the pieces in a napkin, tucking them safely into a drawer behind the register, waiting for a day when someone might know how to put them back together. She lay back on the narrow bed, closed her eyes, and finally, for the first time in nearly 30 hours, allowed herself to rest. Outside Millhaven was waking up to a morning that felt different from every morning that had come before it. A town that had spent years staying quiet was starting, slowly, painfully, to find its voice again. And somewhere across town, in a house on the nicest street with sidewalks on both sides, Walter Dolan was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. Every town has a version of itself it likes to believe in. Millhaven believed it was honest, a place where neighbors still waved from porches and nobody locked their doors at night. For years, that belief had survived by not looking too closely at certain things, at certain names, at the particular way power moved through this town, quiet and unquestioned, the way water moves through a riverbed it has carved for itself over decades. That belief was about to be tested in ways Millhaven had never faced before. By Saturday morning, less than 24 hours after Wren Calloway walked out of a holding cell, a free woman, Sheriff Dale Callahan sat alone in his office with a stack of paperwork spread across his desk and a decision in front of him that would define the rest of his career. He had spent 20 years keeping the peace in this county. Now he had to decide whether keeping the peace and doing what was right were still the same thing. Callahan started with the donation box. It was a small thing, almost embarrassingly simple once he actually looked closely instead of accepting the story handed to him. He drove to the diner early before Peggy opened and asked to see the ledger she kept of donations and withdrawals. Peggy had always been meticulous about that ledger. 22 years of habit had taught her to write down every dollar that went in or out in case anyone ever asked. Someone was finally asking. "Here," Peggy said, sliding the worn notebook across the counter. "Every entry going back 3 years." Callahan flipped through the pages, comparing dates, comparing amounts, until he found the entry from the week the money went missing. There, in careful handwriting, sat a notation Peggy had made herself 2 days before the theft was ever reported. "Withdrew $370 for the Hendricks family house fire relief per usual process." Signed and dated. "You already gave that money away," Callahan said slowly, "before anyone accused Wren of taking it." "I told Grant that," Peggy said, "the night he came to threaten my license." "He didn't want to hear it." "Of course he didn't." Callahan closed the ledger jaw tight. "Because the theft charge was never really about the money. It was about getting Wren out of that diner and out of the way before the council vote." He asked Peggy for a copy of the ledger, thanked her, and drove straight to the county records office, a small brick building 2 towns over that most Millhaven residents had never once stepped inside. There, with help from a records clerk who owed him a favor from years back, he pulled the land transfer documents currently on file for 3 properties along the river frontage. Earl Matson's parcel, Loretta Boyd's half-acre, the Kowalski land, 3 counties removed from anyone paying close attention. 2 of the 3 already carried signatures on the transfer agreements. His stomach tightened as he studied them. The Kowalski daughter's signature looked wrong the moment he examined it under better light. He had met her once, years ago, at her father's funeral. He remembered a woman who wrote everything in small, careful cursive, the kind of handwriting a school stopped teaching decades before she was born. This signature looked different, larger, looser. The sort of person produces quickly without the muscle memory of having written that particular name thousands of times. He called her directly, using the number still listed in the county's old files. "Mrs. Kowalski, this is Sheriff Callahan calling about your father's property near Millhaven." A pause on the line, confusion evident in her voice. "I haven't dealt with that property in months," she said.
"I've been meaning to, but with my job and my kids, it just keeps sliding down the list." "Why? Is something wrong?"
"When's the last time you signed anything related to that land?" Another pause, longer this time. "I haven't signed anything," she said. "Nobody's sent me paperwork. Should they have?" Callahan sat very still, phone pressed to his ear, staring at a signature on a legal document this woman had apparently never seen, let alone sign.
"I need you to do me a favor," he said carefully. "Don't sign anything if anyone does reach out.
"And I might need you to look at some documents in person if it's not too much trouble." He hung up and sat back in his chair, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves into a shape he had suspected for years but never managed to prove. Someone had forged that signature. He compared it once more against a sample of Grant Dolan's own handwriting pulled from an old incident report buried in the department's files. The match was not perfect. Forgeries rarely are to a trained eye. But it came close enough in the particular slant of certain letters, the way the pen lifted between words, to leave him fairly certain he was looking at the same hand behind both documents. He picked up his phone again, calling a colleague at the state police, someone who owed him more than one favor over the years. "I need a handwriting analyst," he said, "and I need this kept quiet until I say otherwise." While Callahan worked, Earl Matson sat in his kitchen staring at the stack of papers he still had not signed. Wren joined him that afternoon, sitting across from him at the same table where he had once shared breakfast with his wife for 30 years. "Callahan called me an hour ago," she said. "He found something." "What kind of something?" "A forged signature on the Kowalski parcel. He thinks Grant did it, or had it done. He's bringing in a handwriting expert to confirm." Earl let out a long breath, one he seemed to have been holding for 2 years. "So this is really happening," he said. "Someone's actually going to look at this properly." "It's happening," Wren confirmed. "But Earl, understand something. This won't be simple, even with proof. Men like the Dolans build protection around themselves for a long time. Walter, especially. 16 years on the council doesn't just disappear because of one forged signature." "So what do we do?" Wren thought a moment before answering. "We make sure it can't be buried," she said. "Quietly is how this town has handled everything for years, and quietly is exactly how the Dolans have gotten away with it. This time, it needs to happen where everyone can see." "The council meeting," Earl said slowly. "There's a special session Wednesday. Final vote on the rezoning now that the first one got tabled." "Then that's where this ends," Wren said. "In front of everyone. No more whispers behind closed doors." Earl studied her. "You've done this before, haven't you? Stood in a room and made something impossible to ignore?" Wren allowed herself a small, tired smile. "A few times," she said. "It never gets easier. It just gets more necessary." Cassidy Rourke stayed in town through the weekend, renting the second small room above the hardware store, working alongside Wren and Callahan to piece together the timeline of everything the Dolans had done over the past several years. They found more than expected. 3 other families, going back 4 years, who had sold land to companies later traced to shell corporations loosely connected to Walter Dolan's business dealings. In every case, the pattern looked similar. Sudden citations, sudden inspection failures, offers that arrived just as the pressure grew unbearable. One family had simply left town, rather than fight moving 2 states away without ever telling anyone the real reason why. "This isn't new," Cassidy said Monday evening, spreading the documents across Callahan's desk. "This is a system they've been running for years. Earl and Loretta just happened to be the ones who finally had someone willing to stand beside them." Callahan rubbed his tired eyes. 20 years I've served this county," he said, "and I let this happen. Right under my nose because I never had enough proof to justify the fight." "You have it now," Wren said. That's what matters. He looked up at her. I still don't fully understand who you are, he admitted. Cassidy's told me enough to know you're not just a waitress who wandered into town. But I haven't asked directly, and I'm not sure it's my business to. Wren considered the question for a long moment.
I spent 15 years in service to this country, she said finally. Places I can't talk about in much detail, doing work that doesn't come with parades or recognition. I came to Millhaven because I wanted to stop being defined by any of that. I wanted mornings that were just mornings. And instead you got this. Instead I got this, she agreed. Some things find you, Sheriff, no matter how carefully you try to live small. Callahan nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his tired expression. Wednesday's meeting is going to be difficult, he said. Walter Dolan doesn't lose gracefully. Neither does his son. I've dealt with worse than an angry councilman, Wren said. The question is whether this town is ready to stand up alongside Earl and Loretta when it matters. We'll find out Wednesday, Callahan said. He gathered the documents spread across his desk, squaring the edges into a neat stack, the careful habit of a man who had spent 2 decades making sure paperwork could survive scrutiny. Can I ask you something else? He said, not looking up right away. Go ahead. Why Millhaven? Of all the places you could have gone, why here? Wren watched the last of the evening light fade through his office window. I had a map once, she said, a long time ago, in a place I don't talk about much. Someone I served with used to mark towns on it, places we said we'd visit someday once the work was finished. Quiet places, places with names that sounded like they belonged to a slower kind of life. Was Millhaven on that map? No, Wren admitted. But it reminded me of the ones that were grain silos, a diner with decent coffee, a town small enough that everyone still says good morning even to strangers. Callahan nodded slowly, understanding something in that answer that went beyond the simple explanation. The person who marked that map, he said carefully. Did they make it to any of those towns? Wren was quiet a long moment. No, she said. They didn't. That's part of why I carry the reasons with me instead. Callahan did not press further. Some things he had learned over 20 years of service were better left exactly where a person chose to leave them. Wednesday, he said instead, standing to walk her out. We'll get through it together. Together, Wren agreed. That's usually how these things go best. Wednesday arrived cold and clear, the first real hint of autumn settling over Millhaven. The town hall filled, early word having spread through the diner, through the hardware store, through every quiet conversation over the past several days that something significant was about to happen at this meeting. Harold and Dot arrived together, taking seats near the front. Ruth Alvarez sat beside Loretta Boyd, the 2 women holding hands. Peggy closed the diner early for the first time in years to attend. Earl Matson sat in the front row dressed in a pressed shirt he had not worn since his wife's funeral, his cane resting against the chair beside him. Wren sat near the back, deliberately wanting the room's attention to stay where it belonged on the people this had actually happened to. The council members filed in, 5 of them taking their seats at the long table facing the room. Walter Dolan sat in the front row, on the opposite side from Earl, silver-haired and composed, his face giving away nothing. Grant Dolan stood near the back wall, in uniform, arms crossed, watching the room with barely concealed tension. The meeting opened with routine business, budget items, a discussion about repainting the water tower, before finally reaching the item everyone had actually come for. Next, the council chair said, we have the final vote on the river frontage rezoning proposal. Earl Matson stood before anyone could continue. Before you vote, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room despite its slight tremor, I'd like to say something, if the council will allow it. The chair glanced nervously toward Walter Dolan, then back at Earl. Go ahead, Earl. Earl gripped the back of the chair in front of him for support. I've lived in this town 78 years, he began. Worked 30 of them driving grain trucks across 3 counties.
Buried my wife 2 years ago, and I've spent every day since trying to hold on to the one piece of land we built together." He paused, gathering himself. 2 years ago, Officer Dolan started visiting me. Friendly at first, then less friendly. Citations that appeared whenever I hesitated to consider selling. Threats, wrapped up nice and legal sounding, but threats all the same. A murmur moved through the room. Walter Dolan's face stayed carefully neutral, though his hands had tightened on the arms of his chair. "I'm not the only one," Earl continued. "Loretta Boyd got the same treatment. And there's a signature on the Kowalski property transfer that the actual Mrs. Kowalski never wrote." He turned toward Sheriff Callahan, standing near the side of the room. "I think it's time someone who actually looked into this told the rest of us what they found." Callahan stepped forward, a folder in his hands. 3 days ago," he said, addressing the full room, "I began an investigation into land transfer irregularities involving 3 properties along the river frontage, all connected to the current rezoning proposal in front of this council." He held up the folder. "I have confirmation from a state-certified handwriting analyst that the signature on the Kowalski parcel transfer does not match Mrs. Kowalski's known handwriting samples. I have a direct statement from Mrs. Kowalski herself confirming she never signed nor received any such documents." The room had gone completely silent. "I also have documentation showing a pattern of citations issued against Earl Matson's property that does not match inspection standards applied elsewhere in this county during the same period. The same pattern appears against at least 3 other families over the past 4 years, all of whom eventually sold land connected to shell companies with financial ties to Walter Dolan." Walter Dolan stood up abruptly. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 16 years spent commanding rooms just like this one. "You're accusing me in front of the entire town based on some handwriting analysis and hearsay?" "I'm presenting evidence," Callahan said calmly. "The council can decide what to do with it, but I'd also like to note for the record that I have a recorded phone call in which your son threatened a currently deployed United States service member in an attempt to gather information he intended to use against a private citizen." Every head in the room turned toward Grant Dolan, still standing near the back wall. His face went pale, then quickly flushed red. "That's a lie," he said. "Whatever you think you have, it's been taken out of context." "You're welcome to explain the context," Callahan said, "once we've all listened to it together." He nodded toward a small speaker set up earlier near the front table and pressed play on the recording Cassidy had brought that first night. Grant Dolan's own voice filled the town hall, unmistakable, threatening, careless, in exactly the way arrogant men often are when they believe nobody important is listening. The room listened in stunned silence as the recording played through nearly 4 minutes of Dolan's voice growing more aggressive, more careless, with exactly what he was willing to say out loud. When it finished, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Walter Dolan, his composure finally cracking, turned toward his son. "You recorded yourself saying that?" "I didn't know I was being recorded," Grant snapped. "That's not the point, and you know it." The 2 men stared at each other, years of careful family control visibly unraveling in front of the entire town. Peggy, sitting near the front, watched the exchange with an expression somewhere between vindication and grief. She had known both men her whole life, had served them coffee across that same counter for years, and watching the mask finally slip from Walter Dolan's face felt less satisfying than she had expected it to. Harold leaned toward Dot, his voice low but audible in the tense hush. "My father sat on this council once," he murmured. "Never thought I'd live to see one of his kind exposed like this in broad daylight." "None of us did," Dot whispered back. "That's the trouble with things like this. They hide in plain sight until somebody finally has the nerve to point at them." Ruth Alvarez sat very still, her hand still clasped around Loretta's. Both women staring at Walter Dolan with expressions that mixed old fear with something newer, something closer to relief. Grant Dolan's eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces staring back at him, the same faces that had once looked away whenever he walked in, now looking directly at him without flinching. Something in that realization seemed to break loose inside him, faster and more violently than anyone expected. That was when everything went wrong. Fast, the way these moments sometimes do. Grant Dolan cornered, humiliated, in front of the same people he had spent years intimidating, reached for the weapon at his hip. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped back as people scrambled away from the aisle. He did not point it at Callahan or at Wren standing near the back of the room. In his panic, his eyes landed on Earl Matson, still near the front row, the man who had started this entire unraveling by simply refusing to stay quiet any longer.
"Sit down!" Dolan shouted, gun raised, hands shaking with adrenaline and fury. "Everyone, sit down right now!"
Earl froze, his cane suddenly useless in his trembling hand. Wren was already moving. She crossed the distance between the back wall and the front row faster than anyone in that room could track her body, low and controlled, years of training surfacing the way it always had, the way it always would when it mattered most.
She reached Dolan just as his finger tightened against the trigger guard, her hand closing around his wrist and twisting sharply upward, redirecting the weapon toward the ceiling in the same motion that swept his legs out from under him. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding harmlessly across the polished wood. Dolan hit the ground hard. Wren's knee pressed firmly but carefully against his shoulder blade, his arm bent behind his back in a hold that immobilized him completely without causing serious injury. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. The town hall sat in stunned quiet, every person there staring at what had just happened in front of them. Callahan moved quickly, retrieving the fallen weapon, radioing for backup, his own hands not quite steady despite 20 years of law enforcement experience. "Grant Dolan," he said, voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, attempted intimidation of a public official, and obstruction of justice." And that's just for what happened in the last 30 seconds. Wren released her hold, carefully stepping back as 2 deputies arrived from the county office earlier that morning in anticipation of exactly this kind of trouble, moved forward to secure Dolan properly. She turned toward Earl, still frozen near his chair, and reached out a steady hand to help him sit back down. "You all right?" Earl's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. "I think so," he said. "That was—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Walter Dolan sat very still as deputies led his son out of the town hall in handcuffs, the same handcuffs someone would later note that Grant had once used on Wren in front of a diner full of witnesses. "This isn't over," Walter said quietly, though his voice had lost most of its earlier authority. "Actually," Callahan said, walking over with the second folder, "it is. I have enough here to open a full investigation into your business dealings as well, Mr. Dolan. The forged signature, the pattern of coercion, the shell companies. This council meeting is being recorded, and I intend to make sure every piece of evidence I've gathered reaches the county prosecutor by tomorrow morning." Walter's face went pale. The composed authority of 16 years finally completely cracking. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. "I know people, this county, this state." "Maybe," Callahan said, "but you don't know everyone, Mr. Dolan, and it turns out this time the people you didn't know were exactly the ones who mattered." Walter Dolan was escorted out shortly after, not in handcuffs, not yet, but under clear instruction not to leave the county while the investigation proceeded. The town hall slowly began to breathe again, conversations breaking out in nervous, relieved bursts across the room. Earl sat quietly, still catching his breath, when Cassidy Rourke approached from where she had been standing near the entrance, watching the entire scene unfold. She looked around the room at the shaken faces, at the town slowly beginning to understand what had just happened in front of them, and made a decision. She stepped up onto the small stage near the council table, raising her voice to carry through the room. "My name is Cassidy Rourke," she said, "and I think this town deserves to know exactly who just saved that man's life a few minutes ago." Wren, standing near Earl's chair, looked up sharply. "Cassidy?" "They deserve to know, Wren," Cassidy said gently. "Not for your sake, for theirs. So they understand what actually happened here today and why." She turned back to the room. 15 years ago, I served alongside the woman most of you know as Wren the Waitress at the Anchor Diner. What most of you don't know is that she spent the next 15 years of her life in specialized service to this country. Work that most people will never fully understand and never should have to. She saved my life more than once. She saved the lives of people I loved. And she walked away from all of it quietly without ceremony because all she wanted afterward was a normal life in a quiet town. The room had gone completely still again, every eye fixed on Wren. She didn't come here looking for recognition, Cassidy continued. She came here looking for peace, but when this town needed someone who wouldn't back down, someone who actually knew how to protect people when it mattered most, it turned out the person who showed up was exactly the right one, whether she wanted the job or not. Wren stood very still, feeling every eye in the room settle on her at once. This was exactly the moment she had been avoiding since the day she arrived in Millhaven, the moment where the quiet stranger became something else entirely in everyone's eyes. But looking around the room at Earl still shaking slightly in his chair, at Loretta, tears streaming down her weathered face, at Peggy, Ruth, Harold, and Dot, every familiar face she had come to know over these past few weeks, she understood something she had not fully understood before. Being known was not the same as being used. Cassidy had been right about that. "I didn't do anything special today," Wren said, though her voice carried clearly in the silent room. "I did what anyone with the right training would have done in the same situation." "That's exactly the point," Earl said, his voice steadier now. "Most of us don't have that training. We just have each other, and whatever courage we can find on a given day. You had both, and you used it to protect people who had no way of protecting themselves." He struggled to his feet, leaning on his cane, and turned to face the rest of the room. 2 years I stayed quiet," he said. "Told myself it was easier that way. Told myself one old man couldn't change anything in this town. Then this young woman showed up, and in less than a month, she taught me something I should have remembered a long time ago." He looked directly at Wren. "Courage isn't about not being afraid," he said. "It's about doing the right thing anyway. That's what my wife used to tell me back when I was young enough to still need reminding." He paused, looking around at the faces watching him, faces he had known his entire life. "I used to think growing old meant you'd already learned everything you needed to know," he continued. "Turns out that's not true. Turns out you can be 78 years old and still learn something new about what it means to stand up for the people around you." I'm grateful for that lesson, even if it came later than I would have liked. Peggy dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron still worn from the diner earlier that morning. "You've always had that in you, Earl," she said. "It just needed somewhere safe to come out." "Maybe," Earl said, "or maybe it needed someone brave enough to go first." The room stayed hushed for a long moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling over everyone present. Then slowly, Ruth Alvarez began to clap. Loretta joined her, then Harold and Dot, then Peggy, then the rest of the room, a wave of applause rising through the town hall, not loud or triumphant exactly, but steady and sincere, the kind that comes from people who finally understand what they witnessed. Wren stood there, uncertain what to do with the sudden warmth directed her way, until Earl reached out and took her hand, squeezing it once. "Let them thank you," he said quietly. "Sometimes accepting gratitude is its own kind of courage." The weeks that followed brought changes to Millhaven nobody could have predicted just a month earlier. Grant Dolan faced charges at both the state and federal level, the recording of his threat against a deployed service member drawing attention from investigators well beyond the county's borders. Walter Dolan's business dealings unraveled slowly under closer scrutiny. The shell companies and forged documents connecting to properties across 3 counties, far beyond just Millhaven's small stretch of river frontage. The rezoning proposal was formally withdrawn. Earl's land, Loretta's half-acre, and the Kowalski property all remained exactly where they belonged with their rightful owners. Sheriff Callahan opened a broader investigation into 2 decades of quiet corruption that had operated in the shadow of Walter Dolan's council seat.
an investigation that would take months, possibly years, to fully unravel.
But it had started. That was what mattered most.
Peggy reopened the diner the following Monday. Same as always, 6 a.m. sharp, coffee fresh regulars filing in for their usual orders. She hung a small handwritten sign near the register that read simply, "Employee of the month, every month, as long as she'll have us." Wren laughed the first time she saw it, a real laugh, unguarded in a way Peggy had not heard from her before.
"You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Peggy said. "I wanted to."
Earl came in every morning at 7:15, same booth, same order. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, no sugar. But something in the way he sat now felt different, straighter, somehow, lighter, like a weight he had carried for 2 years had finally been set down. Loretta joined him some mornings, the two of them talking quietly about nothing in particular, the ordinary conversation of people who had survived something difficult together and found comfort in each other's company afterward. Other changes moved slower, the way real change usually does in a place like Millhaven. The county prosecutor's office announced formal charges against Grant Dolan 3 weeks later, a list that grew longer as investigators uncovered more of what had happened over the previous 2 years.
Coercion, falsifying official documents. The federal charge related to threatening a deployed service member carried the heaviest weight of all. It was not the kind of charge a good lawyer and a familiar last name could quietly make disappear. Several families who had sold land under similar pressure over the previous 4 years came forward once they heard what had happened at the town hall meeting. Each new account adding another piece to a pattern that had operated undisturbed for far too long. 6 weeks later, the state prosecutor filed formal charges against Walter Dolan directly. Racketeering, coordinated fraud across 3 counties, conspiracy to coerce elderly landowners out of property through his son's badge. The evidence Callahan and Cassidy had gathered, combined with the accounts of the families who finally came forward, gave the prosecutor more than enough to build a case that no amount of old influence could quietly bury. Walter Dolan was arrested at his home on the nicest street in Millhaven, the only one with sidewalks on both sides. He did not resist. There was by then nothing left for him to command. He would face trial the following spring. Whatever the outcome, the town had already delivered its own verdict, in the silence that followed him now whenever he was seen in public. The same silence he had once used as a weapon against everyone else. Sheriff Callahan found himself busier than he had been in years, coordinating with state investigators, gathering statements, making sure nothing about the case could be quietly buried, the way so much had been buried in Millhaven before. 20 years, he told Wren one afternoon, stopping by the diner for coffee he actually paid for. 20 years, I told myself I was doing right by this county just by keeping the peace. Never once stopped to ask what all that peace was quietly costing people who couldn't afford to make noise about it. "You're asking now," Wren said, refilling his cup. "That's not nothing, Sheriff." "Feels like it should have happened sooner. Most important things do," she said. "Doesn't make them less important when they finally happen." He nodded, slowly turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I put in for a formal review of every citation issued in this county over the past 5 years, he said. "Going to take months, maybe longer. But I want to know exactly how deep this went, and how many other Earls and Lorettas never had someone willing to stand beside them." "That's the right instinct," Wren said. "Just don't let it become another thing you carry alone." That's usually where things start breaking down again. Callahan looked up at her, something like gratitude in his tired expression. "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose I will." He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup slowly on the counter. "There's something else," he said. "The department's been talking about hiring a second full-time deputy. Someone who actually knows this county, knows the people in it, and won't look the other way just because a familiar name is standing in front of them." "You asking me something, Sheriff?" "Maybe I am. You'd have to think about it. No pressure, either way." Wren considered it, wiping down the counter as she thought. "I'm not sure a badge is the right fit for me anymore," she said. "I spent 15 years wearing one kind of uniform or another. Part of why I came to Millhaven was to stop being defined by what I wear to work." "Fair enough," Callahan said.
Offer stands, though, whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready. I'll think about it, Wren said. That's the honest answer. That's usually the best kind. He finished his coffee, left a generous tip beside the empty cup, and headed for the door, pausing once to look back at her. For what it's worth, he said, this county's better off with you in it, badge or no badge. Wren watched him go, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest. The particular feeling of being wanted somewhere without having to prove anything first. 2 weeks after the town hall meeting, the town council, under new interim leadership, called a small gathering in the same room where everything had unraveled. This time there was no tension in the air. No forged signatures, no threats, just a town trying to figure out how to properly say thank you. The interim council chair stood at the podium, the same podium Earl had stood beside weeks earlier. We'd like to propose something, she said, for the town's consideration, a small display in the entrance hall here, honoring residents who've shown particular courage in service to this community. Starting with a few names that seem obvious given recent events, Peggy had brought something with her that morning, wrapped carefully in the same paper napkin she had used weeks earlier. She stepped forward and unwrapped it gently on the small table set up near the podium. The broken watch. Cracked face-snapped band, exactly as it had fallen weeks earlier on the diner floor. I had it looked at, Peggy said. The mechanism still works if you wind it. The glass and the band, well, those are beyond repairing completely, but I thought maybe it belonged somewhere people could see it. Not fixed, just honored, exactly as it is. Wren, sitting near the front, felt something tighten in her chest. You don't have to put my name on anything, she said, standing up. I told Earl this already. I'm not interested in being a symbol. We're not asking you to be a symbol, the council chair said gently. We're asking permission to remember something true. That sometimes the quietest people in a room are carrying the most weight, and that this town nearly lost something important by not paying closer attention sooner. Wren looked at the broken watch resting on the table, thought of the person who had once given it to her, a promise made in a difficult place a long time ago, that had somehow followed her all the way to this small town and this small moment. If it goes up, she finally said, no name on it, just the watch. Let people wonder about the story if they want to. That feels more honest than a plaque with my name on it. The council chair nodded, understanding something important in that request. No name, she agreed, just the watch. The following Sunday, Millhaven held its regular church service, the small building near the center of town filling with more people than usual, word having spread about everything that happened over the past several weeks. After the service, as people gathered outside in the crisp autumn air, Earl Matson approached Wren dressed again in the same pressed shirt he had worn to the town hall meeting. He stood a little straighter than usual, leaning far less on his cane than she remembered from that first morning at the diner. I wanted to do this properly, he said. Not in a diner, not in a town hall meeting, just here with the people who matter. He straightened his shoulders and slowly, carefully raised his right hand in a salute formal and precise despite his age, despite the slight tremor that had crept into his hands over the years. Wren stood still a moment, surprised, before returning the gesture with the same careful precision, years of training surfacing naturally in her posture. Around them, a small crowd had gathered without quite meaning to, watching two people from very different generations share a moment neither of them fully explained out loud. Thank you, Earl said, lowering his hand, for reminding an old man that standing up still matters, even when your knees don't work the way they used to. Thank you for standing up first, Wren said. I just followed your lead. Loretta Boyd, standing nearby with Ruth Alvarez, wiped her eyes quietly. This town forgot how to do that for a long time, she said. Stand up for each other, I mean. It took a stranger walking in with one duffel bag to remind us. Maybe that's how it always works, Ruth said. Sometimes you need someone from outside to show you the thing you'd forgotten was right in front of you the whole time. That evening, as the sun set over the grain silo at the edge of town, Wren walked slowly through the small park at the center of Millhaven, past the gazebo with its peeling white paint,
past the war memorial listing names from 3 different generations. Cassidy walked beside her, having decided to stay a little longer before returning to her own life beyond Millhaven's borders.
"You could have left town, you know," Cassidy said. "After everything, nobody would have blamed you for wanting somewhere quieter, somewhere nobody knows your name." Wren watched the last light fade behind the water tower.
I thought about it, she admitted, for about a day.
"What changed your mind?"
Earl's booth by the window, Wren said. Peggy's terrible coffee machine that's older than her daughter would have been. Loretta's grocery bags that always seem to tear at the wrong moment. This town isn't perfect, Cassidy. It let something terrible happen for 2 years before anyone found the courage to stop it. But it's also a town that clapped for an old man who finally found his voice again. That's worth staying for. Cassidy smiled, understanding.
"So this is home now?" Wren thought about the question carefully, the way she thought about most important things.
I think it might be, she said. For the first time in a long while, I think it actually might be.
They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, the town settling into evening around them, porch lights beginning to glow one by one, the distant sound of a screen door closing somewhere down a quiet street. Somewhere across town in the entrance hall of the town building, a small display case had been installed that afternoon, still empty except for a single item resting carefully inside. An old watch, cracked face, broken band. No name attached, no plaque explaining its significance, just a small, handwritten card beneath it that read simply, "For those who stay quiet, not out of fear, but because they are waiting for the right moment to stand." People would stop and look at it in the weeks and months that followed. Some would ask around town about its story, piecing together fragments from those willing to share what they knew. Others would simply stand there a moment, understanding, without needing every detail explained, that something important had happened in Millhaven. Something that had reminded an entire town what it looked like to finally, after years of silence, stand up. The bells of the small church rang softly in the distance as evening settled fully over Millhaven, carrying across quiet streets and porch lights, and a town slowly remembering who it wanted to be. Wren Calloway had come looking for peace. What she found instead was something rarer and, in its own way, more valuable. She found a place worth fighting for, and a town that in the end proved willing to fight alongside her. Maybe that is the real lesson buried inside a story like this one, the part that matters more than any single confrontation, more than any gun raised or lowered, more than any watch broken on a diner floor. Strength does not always look like the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it looks like an old man standing on trembling legs because staying silent has finally become harder than speaking up. Sometimes it looks like a diner owner admitting she made the wrong choice and choosing to make it right the very next morning. Sometimes it looks like an entire town slowly, imperfectly remembering how to stand beside each other again. And sometimes it looks like a quiet woman who never wanted to be anyone's hero stepping forward anyway because someone she cared about needed her to. Millhaven is still there if you ever find yourself driving through that stretch of highway where the cornfields end. The diner still opens at 6 every morning. Earl still sits in his booth by the window, though these days he rarely eats alone. Peggy still hums old country songs under her breath when she is happy, though these days she is happy more often than not. And in the entrance hall of the small-town building, past the water tower and the barber shop with its striped pole, a broken watch still sits quietly in its glass case, telling no one's name, asking nothing of anyone who stops to look. Just waiting there patiently for the next person who needs reminding that the quietest people in a room are sometimes the ones carrying the most weight, and that somewhere in every town, in every diner, in every small kindness offered to a stranger struggling with a torn grocery bag, there is a version of standing up still waiting to happen. All it takes is someone willing to go first.